Good afternoon, Peabody Catholic. My name is Father Kevin.
And I'm Deacon Dennis.
And as you know, this is
The Unbelievable Show.
Now, according to my teleprompter here, today is the 5th installation of our Faith-Filled series, which was inspired by my junior theology course over at Bishop Fenwick. I know school has long been over for a few weeks now, but we took several of the questions that the juniors at Fenwick had asked for a Faith-Filled Friday series, and we've divided them up over a course of 5 videos. So today is the 5th and final video. As a reminder, all of the questions that we hope to be answering in this video are posted in the description of the video, so down below. So you can look and see if your questions are down there. And we're actually going to shake things up today. I've been taking the odd number questions. Deacon Dennis has been taking the even. We're just going to flip that, and he's going to go first.
And that's news to me, so we're just going to get started. How can people work to combat poverty during the coronavirus? Now, there's a number of ways we can actually go about combating poverty, which is an important task for us as Catholics. Right? We have what's known as a preferential option for the poor. So all of us ought to see what we can do to help those in need, to help those experiencing poverty, to help alleviate what is afflicting them, to help them in their time of need. There's still a number of shelters being run. There's still a number of organizations that are working to distribute food to the homeless, a number of places that are still trying to do their work to help the homeless and to help those in poverty. Now, because of the coronavirus, because of the pandemic, some places are not asking for volunteers during this time. Some places are not performing their normal tasks and their normal duties because of the fact that they don't want to risk spreading the coronavirus to those who are in poverty and to those who are homeless. Right? We know that those in lower socioeconomic status are at higher risk for coronavirus, especially because of the lack of resources available to them. But some ways that we can help is to look for those organizations that are still doing something and be able to contribute financially to those organizations. I know in our church community, we're still doing things on Fridays to help the homeless in our area. And so I would encourage you to look for those opportunities, to look for those organizations that are actually putting money towards combating poverty, towards helping the homeless, towards helping those in need, and to find ways that you can especially financially contribute and especially spiritually contribute during this time. Your prayers are more effective than anything else because God listens to those prayers, and He'll help ensure, whether it's mediated through our action or through His divine providence in extraordinary ways, that these people can be taken care of.
Which leads right into the second question. Due to coronavirus, do we think that the poor and vulnerable will suffer more because people are scared to volunteer and help them? Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. But like Deacon Dennis said, there are still organizations that, although they're not taking volunteers, they are still taking either monetary contributions. You could go to a grocery store and buy some things. Actually, in fact, last week we had a sophomore from our community, a sophomore in high school, come by and drop off a bag of snacks to me that he had bought with some of his allowance money that he wanted us to give to our Friday outreach program. So it was a very small but big gesture. So St. Teresa of Calcutta tells us, we can do no great things, but we can do small things with great love. And that's what this act was. Somebody out of the kindness of his heart went to a convenience store, bought a few snacks, a few bottles of water, and came and dropped it off to the church. So although people might suffer more, we know that people of faith, people of a generous heart are still there to provide for the needs of the poor, to do the corporal works of mercy that we learn about in our religious ed classes or in our theology classes.
Why is poverty such a big issue in our country, and how did it become one? What are the roots that trace back to the beginning when poverty first started, and is that why it still affects people to this day? That is an excellent question, and it is a much larger question than we can hope to answer in just a couple minutes here. Poverty has always been with us. Poverty has existed since original sin, and that's something that we can't completely eliminate in our day and age. In our country specifically, poverty has always existed from the very beginning, right? The pilgrims were hungry when they first got here. They didn't know how to grow the food that would have been able to have been grown due to the agricultural conditions of the land here in America. When the British were in control, there was taxation without representation. There was another form of poverty happening there. Even after we got our independence, there was still poverty. Right now, the way things stand with capitalism and commercialism present in our society, those who are able to make money get that money. Those who are unable to make money don't. And unfortunately, there is a big gap, a big disparity in the higher class versus the lower class, just because of the way that people can earn money, the way that people make money, and the way that people contribute to the welfare of others. Now, I can't answer for all the causes that contribute to poverty, right? The ultimate cause is sin, and the way we're trying to keep our money for ourselves instead of necessarily trying to help other people. But we know that Jesus says the poor will always be with us, and so it's our duty to help those in poverty.
Seems like Dennis always is leading right into my next question. I don't know if he's doing that on purpose, but the next question is, if there are really ways to slowly end poverty, then why does it seem people aren't really focused on trying to help before the whole COVID problem? Well, one, we looked to the example and to the words of Jesus. Jesus said, "You will always have the poor with you." So Jesus is telling us we're not going to solve poverty. And remember, for those of you who are juniors at Fenwick, we talked about the different types of poverty: spiritual poverty, material poverty, poverty of soul. Remember, so those are things that Jesus is saying, like, poverty is always going to be with you. So while we shouldn't just throw our hands up and give up and say, oh, well, there are always going to be poor people. No, we are called to alleviate their sufferings, as I'll probably answer in a later question. But my succinct, not so succinct answer to that is selfishness. Because humans can be selfish, and we want to take care of us and me before I take care of others. So until we learn how to let our hearts be conformed to Jesus, who, in the kenosis, a very self-emptying, Jesus gave all of himself, and he teaches us to do the same. So until we can learn to give all of ourselves, we're not going to start to solve the problem of poverty.
Why don't people help out the poor more when they are able to? And that's exactly what we've been talking about the last couple of questions. It comes down to sin. It comes down to our own selfish desires, our want to keep everything we have to ourselves instead of sharing it with one another. And that's what causes poverty, right? We ought to help those in need. We ought to help those who are experiencing poverty, but we don't, because of selfishness, because of sin, because of disordered desires. But that's something that by building up virtue in our lives, by following Christ, we hope to overcome those and be able to actually live a life where we want to help one another.
What was Jesus' view on poverty? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Jesus loves poverty. Think about it. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus, the King of Kings, was born in a stable. Jesus could have been born to the richest family in Israel, to the richest family in the Holy Land. But no, he chose to be born to a teenage mother and to be born in a stable, and where animals were being fed, right? That's where he was laid. So Jesus shows us that poverty can be beautiful, that to empty ourselves, to be humble, to be poor in spirit is truly a blessing, because we don't get weighed down by the selfish desires of being rich, right? And so Jesus' view on poverty is that he loves it. Jesus spent time with poor people. He spent time with those who are what society would call, the less off, or, the margins of society. And we who call ourselves Christians, little Christs, are called to do the same. We are called to work with the poor, work for the poor. And so we are called also to love the poor.
What is the church's response when they are asked what kind of God would allow poverty to exist? Well, the kind of God that would allow poverty to exist is the kind of God that loves everyone and respects everyone's free will. All right, we look at a lot of the causes of poverty is due to sin and due to our own selfishness and due to people not wanting to share with one another. Right? Keeping something for oneself prevents you from sharing that with another. And so you're impoverishing the other person by not sharing what you have with them. But God respects our free will. All right, part of our free will is the ability to do good. God has given us the gift of free will to be able to do good, but part of that free will also means we have the ability to sin, and we have the ability to do bad, to do evil. And so a God who allows poverty to exist is the God who loves us so much that he respects our free will and will never impose on that free will.
The next question also kind of leads right into this is sometimes people living in the situation of poverty are miserable for the rest of their lives. So why does God let them suffer without some amount of good to go with it? Well, I'm going to use some big words here, but then I'll explain it. That's a very corporeal way of thinking, right? That's not a very spiritual way of thinking. That's thinking of just the needs of the body. But remember, God created us body and soul. And so our spiritual needs are also equally important to our bodily, our corporeal needs. And so even if somebody is living in a situation of material poverty, right? They don't have enough income to have proper housing, maybe proper food, proper water, clothing. But that doesn't mean that they're spiritually poor. That doesn't mean that they're lacking in the things of God. In fact, I have been to several third world countries, and the people that I've encountered are almost more joyful and happier than we are. In fact, talk to some of the students at Bishop Fenwick, if you are a Fenwick student, who went with me over February break down to St. John's and St. Thomas Mission down in Santiago, Dominican Republic, our sister parish. And one thing that kept blowing the Bishop Fenwick students away, as well as the other teens that came with us, was how happy the people are. But when we saw what their houses looked like, what their roads looked like, what their country looks like, it was baffling to us, because we don't think body, spirit. We think only body. And so God in a sense, he doesn't just let them suffer with no purpose. That's where his church, the body of Christ, is called to alleviate the sufferings of the poor. So if people are suffering, it's because we're not doing our job. We are not going out and loving our brothers and sisters, loving the poorest among us, as we are called to do. The Catechism of the Church, of the Catholic Church, teaches that our reception of the Eucharist commits us to serving the poor. It commits us. We make a commitment every time we receive Holy Communion to serve the poor among us. Now, for thought, how many of us actually do that? Myself included. So it's a call, a wake-up call to us, that when I receive Holy Communion, I'm nourished by the body of Christ to go out and to serve the poor.
Instead of trying to solve poverty, does the church or God do anything to prevent poverty? Now, that's a very good question. As we know, the causes of poverty are numerous. There's so many interplaying factors. It's hard to actually find the deepest roots of poverty and to be able to eliminate those. And so what the church wants to do is, yes, we want to help eliminate poverty. We want to help alleviate poverty. But the church also wants us to take a look at those root causes of poverty. And yes, the church also invites us to see how we can help eliminate the root causes of poverty in our society. For instance, if war is a contributing factor towards poverty, then one thing we can do is try to seek peace in our world. By eliminating war, by eliminating unjust war, we can eliminate one of these roots of poverty, one of these sources of poverty. So the church does commit us to finding these roots of poverty and to help eliminate them instead of simply alleviating poverty as it exists?
I'm going to actually combine my last two questions because in reading them, in reading question number 10, I realized I was going to answer 12. So 10, could scientists start finding a way to clone food to help world hunger? And 12, are we able to eliminate poverty with the wealth throughout the entire world? So scientists probably could come up with a way to clone food, but my answer is going to be it's not going to help if we are still selfish, right? Think about the last meal you ate or the next meal you're going to eat, or think about the food in your refrigerator. How many times do we throw away food that is perfectly good, right? Or how many times do we have food that's left over? We take more than what we need, is basically what I'm trying to say. Myself included. I'm guilty just as much as everybody else is. But that, scientists being able to clone food isn't going to do it much, because then the people who are harvesting it and growing it are going to feel the need to be selfish and keep more for themselves, as we see happening, as evidenced by the fact that there are starving people throughout the world. Think about what we talked about in our class when we talked about the preferential option for the poor, both domestically and around the world. And so if we as a society, we as humankind, can learn to be more generous and less selfish, I think we could work to eliminate hunger. We'll post down in the description some sources. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I know that I've read them, so I'll post where they're coming from. But there's enough wealth in the world to end human hunger. But why are people still hungry? Like, we don't need to create more food. The money is there to end the poverty, to make sure everybody has a fair shot of buying the food that they need, the material goods that they need in order to survive. So how do we work to be more generous? And that's not to say that every rich person is selfish, because there are very, very wealthy people who are very generous with their treasure, with their time, and with their talent, and do work to help others. But how do we, at first as a church, and then as a society, how do we shift our mind from selfishness to selflessness? And until we learn to do that, we're not going to solve anything. So no amount of scientific cloning is going to end poverty, because people are just going to remain selfish. And I know that's a pessimistic outlook on it, but we've been seeing it for years. So unless we learn to change our hearts, we're not going to see a change.
And one thing I want to add to that is, scientists have the technology, they can clone these foods, but guess what? There's going to become a market for that as well. Mm-hmm. And those scientists are going to want to make a profit off of all these cloned foods. And guess what? If people want even better cloned food, they'll pay more for that. Markets are going to be created. And so you're going to create even more economic disparity. And this contributes all to what Father Kevin has just been saying. It all stems from selfishness. And so we have to look to see how our hearts can be transformed. How do certain parts of the world deal with poverty in different ways? Now, that's a very good question. We're used to seeing how things in America work, right? We have all kinds of organizations that help the poor. You have the Boston Food Bank. You have all these local organizations, church organizations, looking to help alleviate poverty in a lot of ways. Soup kitchens, homeless shelters, you name it. There's a lot of ways we find here. It's not always the case around the world. In different parts of the world, you have different immediate situations that have to be dealt with first. For instance, in the Middle East and in a lot of places in Europe, refugee camps become a more pressing issue. And that's why you have refugee camps in place to help those who have to flee from danger.
Deacon Dennis kind of answered questions 11 and 13 in that. But one organization that I want to call attention to is Catholic Relief Services. When I was in the seminary, Catholic Relief Services came to my seminary in Rome, and during our Easter break, they actually allow a few seminarians to go on what's called an immersion trip. And so every year it's in a different place. And so I went my 4th year when I was a deacon, and we went to Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and the Gambia in Western Africa. And that trip was meant for us. There was a priest on the trip, 2 deacons, and a seminarian. So, and now we're all priests. But it was meant for priests and future priests to see what Catholic Relief Services does throughout the world. And Catholic Relief Services, you might know it from the little rice bowl that we put out during Lent at our churches, but it's actually a much bigger organization than just a rice bowl during Lent. CRS has been around for over 75 years, and it's the social justice arm of the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so the US bishops have kind of endorsed this organization to be the American church's ambassador, representative, missionary even?
Sure.
Missionary around the world in different countries, regardless of race, creed, color, nationality, whatever. We go, CRS goes all around the world. And their mission is just to help combat global poverty. And we do it, through faith and action, pretty much. Because the Eucharist, as I said earlier, commits us to the poor. So CRS goes out and serves others not because they're Catholic, but because we are.
Exactly. And CRS has established itself in so many areas throughout the world, and not just doing immediate emergency relief, but also creating sustainable communities and places where you can help eliminate poverty, not simply by going in a very short-term basis, providing some money and then leaving, but they're going and establishing long-term solutions, creating sustainable communities where poverty can be eliminated in the long term. And so CRS is doing an amazing mission right now. Both Father Kevin and myself are CRS Global Fellows, and we're very committed to the mission of Catholic Relief Services, because they're there to help alleviate poverty throughout the world. And while CRS is doing this on the global front, right in our very homes, Catholic Charities is doing the exact same thing here in our own country to help alleviate poverty here in the Boston area, in the United States in general. And so I encourage you to look at the resources that they have, because they have a lot of excellent faith-based, Catholic-based resources on how we can help alleviate poverty during our time.
Yeah, I mean, many of you, if you're a Fenwick student, I've used some of the CRS resources in class, and you might not have ever known, but I just want to call attention to something Deacon Dennis said. So, as many of you know, I took a group down to the Dominican Republic over February vacation, and we called that a mission trip. Why? Because St. John's and St. Thomas Church in Peabody have a sister parish in Santiago in the Dominican Republic. And so what we do is we go down to Santa Rosa de Lima, and we work with the pastor there for a various project that he has for his parish. So this past year, they were trying to build a community center. So we went, we primed and painted this community center, this outdoor space, or open air space, I should say, rather. And then a couple days we went and visited orphanages, 2 orphanages, one an all-girls orphanage and one an orphanage for younger children, basically like infants through maybe 6-7 years old. And we brought them clothes, toys, medicines, stuff like that. But those are mission trips. Those we went to do, and then we came home. And one thing that is different from the immersion trip that I mentioned that I went on to Africa earlier is the immersion trip, we went and we saw what CRS helps to do. So CRS doesn't do itself, but people go out and they teach. There's that old proverb that if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man how to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. And actually, so one of the projects I visited in Senegal, in Ziguinchor, I don't know if that's the French pronunciation, but it sounded good to me, but was a fish farm. So 3 distinct tiny villages all came together, and CRS taught them how to farm fish so that they could bring it to a local market and start to make money for the communities. It's called SILC, Savings and Lending Communities. something like that. Look it up on their website.
So hopefully this whole explanation answers this last question that we had here, which is, what are some ways the church works to help the poor? We've given you 2 big resources on what the Catholic Church actually does to help alleviate poverty, to work with the poor. Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Charities. Look them up. They're on the USCCB website. We'll be linking that down below. So take a chance to actually take a look at it and see what your church is doing to help alleviate poverty today.
And be proud. Be proud of the fact that you are Catholic, you are an American Catholic, and by such you are privileged to be helping work to combat global poverty around the world. That is our 5th and final Faith-Filled Series question. Maybe some more questions were brought up. We hope that you put them in the comment section below. I actually am not monitoring that. Are you?
Maybe.
So Deacon Dennis is maybe monitoring the questions, and if we get several, maybe we'll make another video. As you know, this is Faith-Filled Series week, so we've had a video every day this week, but typically we only post the Unbelievable Show once a week. So depending on your questions, what you're curious about, it might be the topic of future shows, future presentations.
Exactly. So we hope you had a great time this week learning something, hopefully, from all the questions that you have brought to us. If you have any more questions, like Father Kevin said, drop a comment or just message one of us. We are more than happy to keep the conversation going. So although we've been answering these questions on camera, we hope that these questions can engage the larger conversation so that we can keep learning, we can keep growing in our faith, and we can keep having this conversation with one another, because that's how we learn, by actually asking the questions and actually seeking to understand. So we hope you can join us next week for the next episode of The Unbelievable Show, and until then, take care.